Friends, may I wish each one of you today a happy Thanksgiving. As you can see from your order of service, the Lord's table next to me, in our worship time today, we will celebrate together the Lord's Supper, sometimes called communion. You may know that in some Christian traditions, this celebration is known as the Eucharist, which means literally thanksgiving. So it is truly a fitting thing that we celebrate it on this occasion. It was at his Last Supper, of course, with his 12 closest followers, that Jesus told them and us, before he was betrayed by one of the 12, to continue to remember him with a similar meal of bread and wine, these two elements being the things which symbolize his body and his blood, which he laid down for us. To this day, along with Christians around the world, we come to this table to remember Jesus and to thank him. Yet, in a sense, we also come to stand by his side and to proclaim him and to proclaim his love and his faithfulness for the world. Well, that sounds great, of course. We ministers can make things like this sound so special. But in real life, the celebration of the Lord's Supper doesn't always seem so impressive. I remember the very first time I was involved in serving communion. Several years ago, I was a student minister, and for a few weeks, I'd been visiting an elderly man in his nursing home. I and others had noticed that he was really starting to go downhill fairly quickly. And there was a desire that I go and take the communion elements to him. Well, I was living at home at the time, and so I remember going down to the kitchen and getting out of my parents' freezer a frozen slice of whole wheat bread and defrosting it in the microwave. Next, I went to the fridge, and I could have sworn that my parents had some Welch's grape juice. My dad's a minister. Don't ministers keep that kind of thing on hand? Well, I opened the door, and to my horror, there was no grape juice. The closest thing available was a bottle of Ribena. For those of you not aware, Ribena is concentrated black currant juice. You mix it with water, and it makes a nice fruity drink. It doesn't taste anything like grape juice, but it's dark purple, and I thought it would do the trick. After all, I wasn't even sure that this gentleman would be able to stay awake for communion, let alone tell the difference. So I mixed a glass of Ribena, and I tasted it, and it was far, far too sweet. I decided maybe if I water it down as much as possible, it will taste a bit like watered down grape juice. So that's what I did. I took the bread and the juice and I packed it up in my little minister's traveling communion kit. I went off to the nursing home. The gentleman, Frank, was pretty alert and interactive during our little communion service. When he sipped out of his little cup, he got this strange look on his face, like he had just sucked on a sour lemon. And he said, "There's something wrong with that grape juice." Of course, I feigned ignorance. I had no idea what he was talking about. Many times I've served communion with the intinction method. Intinction comes from an old Latin term. You might translate it rip and dip. People from the congregation will come forward, receive the bread, dip it in the juice, and then consume it. Nice thing about intinction is it's active. It calls for a response and the people to come forward together. And with the chunks of bread and the dipping action, it really is a feast, not just for the soul, but for the senses. But so many times, friends, I've been standing there with the chalice, and some poor soul has come along and gone to dip their bread, but drop it in the cup. And they've come with a look on their face of joy and thanksgiving, which quickly turns to fear and embarrassment. In that moment, I can see the person's wheels turning. They're wondering, should I go in after the bread? Is this a good time to get my hands dirty? Well, there are these and a lot more awkward moments in my job. But I am fortunate, truly privileged, to spend so much of my time working as a servant of the church, where we moved from. Most of the people had spent at least some of their time working in tobacco. We came to Barrie from Norfolk County in southern Ontario, and tobacco is the staple industry historically. Most people my age and older had spent at least some time working in tobacco, and that is an example, in contrast to my work as a minister, of something that I wouldn't be as good at and wouldn't like as much. Why wouldn't I like it as much? Not because I'm morally superior to those who have been involved in it, but simply because it is such hard, back-breaking work. Tobacco, for those of you who don't know, is the most labor-intensive crop that you can grow. It has a number of very labor-intensive steps. Early in the spring, when it's still cold, the farmer will cover the floor of a greenhouse in soil and plant the tobacco seeds. For a few weeks, those little seedlings are nurtured. Then when they're big enough and when it's warm enough outside, the seedlings are picked by hand, put in boxes, taken out to the field, and then again planted carefully by hand. That doesn't sound so bad, except that you have to do it for maybe 50 or 60 acres or more. Once that's done, the workers have to, for the rest of the summer, continue to maintain the field. It has to be weeded, and the plants have to be closely monitored. When the plant shoots out a flower, that flower has to be quickly taken off of each tobacco plant in the field. But it's in the harvest where it's especially labor intensive. A whole team of people have to go through the field plant by plant, and beginning with the very bottom leaves, take them off the stalk one by one, where they're then put on a wagon, which is taken back to the kiln area. Someone will tie all of these leaves into giant 30 to 50 pound bundles, where they're then hung in the kiln and baked for a few days. Later, they're put in a barn to be steamed, where they then dry off again. And then finally, the tobacco bundles are wrapped in paper and put on pallets for shipping. And after that's all done, they have to go back and take off all the middle leaves by the plant entirely by hand, go through the whole process over again, and then go back again and take off the top leaves one by one, all by hand. Now, the method I've described may vary a little bit from farmer to farmer and from region to region, but no matter what, wherever you try to grow tobacco, you need a lot of people who will work hard and, most of all, work together. The church and tobacco are very different, of course, but in this way they are very similar. They require a group of people who will come together, work hard, and work most of all together. The Apostle Paul said as much as this in his first letter to the church in Corinth. News had come to Paul that this Christian community which he had helped to found was breaking down into party factions. Some people in the community that they were saying, we belong to the party of Paul. Others were saying, we belong to the party of Apollos, another early leader. There was jealousy between the different groups of people. There was dislike. And worst of all, there was disunity. Attitudes and behaviors such as this, noted Paul, were none other than the product of human sin. Paul in no way said that the different tensions and conflicts going on were some kind of constructive process by which the people were making a way forward. No, he said that these were symptoms of the flesh. He means that the people in their animosity were being dominated by the desires and the lusts of the flesh. And by that provocative phrase, he did not refer to secret, illicit, destructive, sexual or other behaviors. No, he meant by the lust of the flesh something which unfortunately we in our day and age have rather learned to take for granted. That is simple disunity among God's people. It was a serious problem, but the solution he offered was a simple one, and that was to remind the people of this message. You are one in Jesus. Paul, he said, may have planted the seed of your faith. Apollos may have come along a little later and watered it, but so what? It is God who gives the growth. Said Richard Hayes of Duke University, who is one of the greatest Christian minds of our time. The field hands can only do what they're told to do, but they are utterly powerless to make the seed come to life. It is God who makes the good news of Jesus take root and spring up into a living community of faith. Friends, this simple message was true in Corinth, and it is just as true for us today. Imagine for a moment that this congregation was breaking down into party factions. Imagine some of you were saying, we belong to the church of Will. Others saying, we belong to the church of Andrea or to the church of Ruth. Imagine the choir was being pitted against the ushers, or the elders being pitted against the stewards. If that were ever to happen, friends, we would not be doing God's work, because we would not be doing it as people who are one in Him. In contrast, however, we can and do serve God effectively when we sow the seeds of unity by our kindness and our faithfulness and our love for God and one another. In the New Testament, there are a lot of analogies between agriculture and life as a community of Jesus followers. Jesus said of God's coming kingdom, for example, the fields are ripe for the harvest, but oh, the laborers are few. Who among us will do the work of God's kingdom? Where we came from in Norfolk County, the tobacco industry is in decline as it is around the world. And yet there is still tobacco, some of it being grown. I think there were about 250 farmers who planted tobacco this year. What's most different from previous times, however, is that the work is no longer being done by the people of the area. Rather, the farmers have to hire offshore workers. It seems as Canadians, we don't want to do that kind of hard, back-breaking work anymore. What about we as Canadian Christians? Are we willing to step out of our comfort zone and do the sometimes difficult work that God calls us to do? To get our hands dirty and to pull together. 45 years ago, there was a well-known Canadian Catholic theologian named Gregory Baum. In an article, he critiqued the United Church in particular for focusing on helping Canadian Christians to live a comfortable life, possibly in a nice suburb. Around the same time, well-known writer Pierre Berton criticized not our church specifically, but churches like ours for offering the world little more than a comfortable pew. Yet, it is when we do the dirty work, and most of all when we do it together, that we become greater than the sum of our individual parts, and in fact, that God sprouts and grows a living community of faith in our midst. Last night, as mentioned, some folk from our congregation offered to the community a clothing depot and a Thanksgiving meal. Because of a prior commitment, unfortunately, I couldn't be there. But in the days that led up last week, I saw the preparation and how warmed my heart was to see a group of people working so hard and working in concert to do God's work in this community. As we come to the table in a few minutes, we must come as comrades who are one in Jesus, so that it is Him we remember, and so that it is Him we actually proclaim. And we come to the table willing to get our hands dirty, not in the juice. Friends, if at some point in the future you ever drop your bread in the juice, forget about it. God still loves you. Think about the folks behind you. But we must come to the table willing, in a broader sense, to get our hands dirty in service to God. Remember, we follow one who most certainly got his hands dirty. He was Jesus. In his daily labor, he got his hands dirty. The New Testament tells us in its Greek language he was a tekton. Tradition holds that he was a carpenter, but tekton could mean more broadly a tradesman. So he worked with his hands. In his service to God, he got his hands dirty. He was willing to touch the untouchable, those who were sick and unclean. At the end of his life, he most certainly got his hands dirty. For it was on the cross that his hands were nailed through for us with giant metal spikes where they were bloodied. He died. Yet, like a seed falling to the ground, he died that God might spring forth new life in him. Today, we work as co-workers together under God. One day, like him, we too will die. Yet, in being planted, God will use us as seeds to sprout a living community of faith. So, for our labor, for our rest, and one day for our reward, let us give thanks to our gracious and wonderful God. Let us give thanks to God today, tomorrow, and always. Amen. Our next hymn is 703.